How could the world go back to the way it was when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Even darkness must pass. Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings has a rich story, especially when it comes to constructed languages, like one of its most famous, Sindarin. If you've ever come across a piece of media with constructed languages, then you may want to know how they are made so that when you come across another one, you can truly appreciate it. I watched The Lord of the Rings as a kid and loved them. I was fascinated by the language of the elves and how real it made the world seem. In order for you to truly understand Sindarin, you should know how it was made, how it was used, and its impact on people. First, let's start with how it was constructed. Sindarin was not an easy thing to create, and its creator, J.R.R. Tolkien, had an interest in language throughout his life. This is him pictured here. I acquired this photo from biography.com, last updated September 11th, 2019. And Professor Suzanne Robbins explains in the Man in the Word Journal in an article titled Old English, Old Norse, Gothic, Sources of Inspiration and Creativity for J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings in 2015 that in his years at Oxford he researched and studied Anglo-Saxon and Northern European languages. Going back to Robbins' article, she claimed he used his expert knowledge of these languages to create much of what is found in Lord of the Rings. But not only that, they were also inspired by many real-world languages we know today. Professor of Literature Yoko Hemi described in a Tolkien Studies journal in an article entitled Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Its Concept of Native Language, Sindarin and British Welsh, that British and Welsh were significant precursors aesthetically to Sindarin and modeled how he wanted his language to develop in his world. Dr. Dimitra Fimi explained in the Journal of Tolkien Research in an article titled Language as Communication versus Language as Art, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Early 20th Century Radical Linguistic Experimentation in 2018, that Tolkien took inspiration from Finnish and Welsh for the phonology, or the sound, of the languages. This is an example of the phonology of Finnish. This displays how certain vowels sound. This is something that he would use to model how his vowels would sound in his language. And this is a photo of how Sindarin is written, how it's meant to be. I acquired this photo from San Jose State University's faculty website that was last accessed July 18th, 2020. And I acquired this from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, last updated fall 2018. All that work that went into creating it wasn't for nothing, of course, since Tolkien knew its meaning in his own work. It had multiple uses in the context of The Lord of the Rings, but specifically it was used as the language of the elves. This is the first book in the Lord of the Rings series, The Fellowship of the Ring. And referencing Hemi's article, Sindarin evolved over many thousands of years in Middle-earth and became the most popularly used elven language in the story. And Middle-earth is the world of these books. And going back to Hemi's article, she described how Elvish was a kind of native language of the world and was known almost subliminally to characters who hadn't even ever learned it. But it was also an inspiration for the story as a whole and helped enhance it. Again, going back to Robbins' article, Tolkien's book, The Lord of the Rings, came out of his love of inventing languages. For him, the language came before the story. And relating back to Hemi's article, she described how Tolkien asserted that Elvish also came before much of the events in the story and served as a sort of mythos for the story as a whole, and he often stressed its importance. But the language wasn't only an inspiration for The Lord of the Rings, it also had left a big mark on society as a whole. Sindarin had a great impact on many fans of the series, and more precisely, it had an impact on popular culture. TV New Zealand in November 27th, 2012, broadcasted their weatherman dressed as an elf, and he gave the weather in Elvish and English, and referenced many places in Tolkien's world. Also, writer A.V. Soak's article on Washington Post's website on May 16, 2019 stated that since the languages of Tolkien's world have been created, many other constructed languages have popped up in other parts of pop culture, like Klingon in Star Trek or Dothraki from Game of Thrones. An example of how much those have impacted us in society is that this app called Duolingo, an app where you learn about different languages, now has Klingon and High Valyrian in them. So the impact that Sindarin has had on these languages has also impacted us. but also more specifically, it impacted education. Writer Ashley Strickland's article on CNN's website on April 8, 2020, reported that scientists found a new species of reptilian fossil and they were inspired by Lord of the Rings to name after the Sindarin word for elfstone, which is Elisar. According to San Diego State University's News Center website on June 30th, 2015, they stated that San Diego State University had added a new language class where they learn about constructed languages like Elvish and Klingon, as I mentioned earlier. As shown, the language of Sindarin has had an effect on many different people. Even though Sindarin started out as a mere interest of Tolkien's, it developed into something that had a cascade of effects. In turn, we wouldn't have many of the constructed languages that we enjoy today without it, and it also would have affected how education on constructed languages is taught, and many people would be without their inspiration. So many people have a creative outlet that they use in their everyday lives that could end up having a big impact, such as this. So no matter how small your hobby may be, it could end up inspiring somebody to act. So, Anon Ellen, or thank you for listening.